If you're religious, you have, I think, a better feeling toward it. You're supposed to go to heaven, ideally not hell, but you're supposed to go to heaven if you're good. I think our country's missing a lot of religion. I think it really was a much better place with religion. It was almost a guide, to a certain extent it was a guide. You want to be good to people. Without religion, there are no guardrails. I'd love to see us get back to religion, more religion in this country.
Angela Denker, it is great to have you on the Ken Harbaugh Show. You're a Lutheran pastor and a journalist, and I think we talked last year about your book, Red State Christians, but we need to get an update now that we're in the home stretch of this election, and it has become more apparent than ever that the Christian nationalists have taken over not just the Trump-Vance campaign, but the whole of the Republican Party. I want to start by getting your reaction to that clip of Donald Trump talking about religion and heaven. Do evangelicals still see him as a useful tool like they did a few years ago, a Cyrus figure, if you will, or have they come around to actually thinking he is one of them?
I think rather than him becoming one of them, I think they've become one of him in many ways.
Yeah, spot on, right.
Yeah. So I think, and the sad part, especially for people like me who've been in the trenches researching this for a long time and came into it with a lot of hope at the start, I certainly still see places of hope, but at the same time, I think he's really become a messianic figure and in many ways has, supplanted, continued to replace the genuine worship of Jesus Christ with this strongman worship that's being represented in Trump. And almost everything else has been discarded, which is when you try to think about a post-Republican Party, should Donald Trump be defeated in November, it's almost impossible to imagine what that looks like.
I have quoted you more times than I can remember from our last conversation when you made the point that when challenged, evangelicals, broadly speaking, there are obviously always exceptions, but when challenged these days, they tend to choose politics over faith. They tend to choose political ideology over theology. Is that holding up? I mean, I see it anecdotally, but is that part of what we're seeing with this messianic conversion of Trump?
Yeah, definitely. And, too, of course, this tends to be most pronounced. It's certainly become even more significant with the entrance of Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee, that this is a white phenomenon in many ways. There's certainly exceptions to that. But when we're talking about who is trading in politics for worship, it does tend to be white Christians.
I was at the DNC. I was, fully bought in. The American flags got me there. It was an unbelievable display of genuine patriotism and the kind of patriotism that I believe in, which is trying to make America live up to its promise. But it made me think of the dramatic contrast between that display and what we saw at the Republican convention. And in a conversation with another guest, we got to this point, which I think is mirrored in your observation about the evangelical church today, which is that the Republican Party has become a reflection of Trump. And the exact opposite applies with the Democratic Party. What I saw in that convention center was a nominee reflecting the country, reflecting her party, reflecting the diversity and the joy and the hope and the patriotism. And she was selected because she represented what we think America should be, as opposed to Trump, the strongman, driving this metamorphosis of the Republican Party. Can you map that onto the evangelical movement as well? He has changed it that fundamentally?
Yeah, and we see too, with so many leadership positions in the RNC and the places where donations are going, that it's become such a grift. I mean, to the Trump family fortune. And you see that in other authoritarian countries, of course. So that becomes the focus there. And then when we look again, at the contrast with the DNC, I mean, here I am in Minnesota. So, of course, with the selection of Tim Walz, and you see the Mankato High School football team up there on the stage. What a moment. What a crazy moment. I think for rural Midwesterners, and I want to talk about an exchange I had with a rural conservative pastor, longtime Republican in Western Minnesota. And he wrote me an email and just said, he's still really struggling with the upcoming election. He's not sure if he should write somebody in. He can't get on board with Trump. But he was trying to figure out what was, going on with Walz. And we had this really productive conversation about, this forgotten sense that so many rural Americans have, and wondering, who's authentic. Trump has tried to seize that mantle of authenticity. But I think Tim Walz in many ways exposes him, because here really is a rural person. Here really is a person who doesn't come from privilege. And so at the end of this conversation with this rural pastor, he came around to saying, I see where in my criticisms of Walz, I can see where he has dropped the ball. But he said, I see where I've dropped the ball too. And I can come to a place where I can forgive that. Whereas the problems with Donald Trump are really more fundamental when Christians really examine where Trump is at when it comes to their faith. But to get to that point of examination, you have to have this relationship of trust, which I had with this pastor. You have to have space to have a conversation. And in many cases, we don't have that with folks.
As a Minnesotan, I got to ask, were you holding out on us? Did you guys know all along how great Tim Walz was, and you were just letting us figure it out for ourselves?
Well, I did. I mean, and of course, he's not perfect. There's things that he's done wrong. I live in Minneapolis. We love Minneapolis. We don't lock our doors. We live by City Park, but it's not perfect. There's stuff too that we want to change. But yeah, I didn't think that Walz was going to be the selection, but I was hoping he was. For those reasons, public school teacher background. My mom's a public school teacher. So is my mother-in-law. My brother was a public school teacher. And it made me glad that Kamala Harris could see that kind of appeal was important for the Democratic Party against the advice of many strategists. But to have that sense that, no, this is important in who we are as Democrats, a military veteran, really, really important stuff that I'm, of course, as a Minnesotan, we're like, yes, people see us.
As a dad, I don't think the importance of the example he is setting of a positive version of masculinity can be overstated, because he's up against, in Trump advance, two people who project exactly the wrong image of masculinity that I want my son growing up with. I mean, Trump, we don't even need to address that. People know who he is. But in J.D. Vance now, we have someone who's a heartbeat away potentially from the presidency, who thinks that the federal government should be tracking the travel of pregnant women, who thinks that childless women add no value to society, and that childcare policy should be having grandparents and aunts pick up the slack. I mean, he just said that last week. And next to Tim Walz, I can't wait for Americans to see that contrast and make their choice.
Yeah. I keep finding myself in the crosshairs of American politics with the work that I'm doing. So my first book was looking at the 2016 election. My next book comes out in March, and it's called Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. And it's really looking at masculinity from my perspective as a mom of 2 white Christian boys, and also as a researcher. We're talking today, the day after yet another school shooting in Georgia. So many of the hallmarks that I saw when I was looking at what's going on with young white men, particularly in rural contexts, in red states, it is incredibly tragic, incredibly sad. And at the same time, to see Gus Walz standing up and saying, that's my dad in this emotional moment, I do think it's going to be a really important contrast. And I think we've had so much focus on femininity and women, and that's been all really important. But now as we turn to look also at what's going on with young men and understanding masculinity, I think it's important for Democrats to also have something to say of what do Democrats think is a vision of masculinity, and what do maybe progressive Christians think is a healthy vision of masculinity in contrast to what we've seen from the conservative Christian right.
Yeah, the gun thing, and I get choked up even just talking about it, especially in the context of this week. First week that kids are back in school. I dropped my daughter off this morning. And the fact that parents have to think about, whether they're going to see them again. A friend of mine online said, remember what they're wearing, because, it might be the last time. At the same time, the Republicans are working harder to ban books than they are to keep AR-15s. It's likely an AR was used in this shooting out of the hands of disturbed kids. It just makes your blood boil. But the response continues to be, and we saw this just today from Governor Kemp, thoughts and prayers. Don't politicize this, even though politics is what got us here. How did the party of supposed, Christian values embrace the totemic power of firearms? I know there's a link, and we've touched on it before, but these aren't two separate threads. The Christian nationalism and the gun worship are intertwined.
Yeah, and this idea of masculinity as something that is under attack and must be defended, and this, so many young white men and boys who I see embracing these ideas, at the root of it is a deep-seated insecurity, a deep-seated sensitivity and emotionality that's being suppressed. And the gun is so tied to this vision of masculinity. I mean, it is school shooters overwhelmingly are male. And so it's all so tied together. And at the same time, Christian conservative pastors love to cite the passage of Jesus turning over the tables as a sign that Jesus is this angry man. I think we need to look at the reasons for Jesus' anger in this moment. Jesus was most angry. His most angry moment was when religious leaders were exposed as hypocrites and selling their souls for money. Well, what has the Republican Party done when it comes to guns? They've sold their souls for the support of the gun lobby and the money that comes along with that. I also do keep thinking of, too, just the idea of the gun as a phallic symbol and this symbol of male virility and male strength in place of real masculine strength and fortitude that's often grounded in sensitivity and love for women. That's another thing with Tim Walz. I love that statement that, yeah, he won the sharpshooting contest. But he also is someone who really shifted from an A rating from the NRA to an F rating. And that was because, I think, of his experience as a teacher and his experience seeing the effects of school shootings. One of the chapters in my new book is focused on education. So I spent a lot of time interviewing teachers. And this one teacher I interviewed, he's a longtime gym teacher, basketball coach, tall guy, just this paragon of what people think of as a strong masculine figure. And he also spoke really candidly about how afraid he is of school shootings. And not only afraid of what could happen to him, but also of his inability to protect his students. So I think we need more stories like that to counter just this naked grab for money in favor of children's lives.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here because I have two favors to ask. We're off to a great start with the Ken Harbaugh Show on YouTube, but the podcast needs a little love. Please click the link below to follow, rate, and review. The success of shows like this really does depend on those ratings. And if you haven't yet followed me on Patreon, please check it out. It's free to sign up, or you can pitch in a few bucks a month. Every dollar goes back into this show and our pro-democracy efforts, including the reporting from Ukraine. Go to patreon.com/Ken Harbaugh. Thanks for the support. Angela, I want to talk more about the book that's coming out in March. Haven't read it yet. I hope you'll send me a galley copy as soon as it's ready. But I love the title, Disciples of White Jesus. And it makes me want to probe this weird obsession among the American religious right with the whiteness of Jesus. And I wonder how they would react if they actually met the historical Jesus, who was the child of immigrants, itinerant, and not white.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, as a Lutheran pastor, I always, when I think about those kind of questions, I begin with self-introspection and I begin with self-reflection. And I wonder, what would I think? What would I really think? How many times have I passed Jesus on the street and ignored him? And I'm sure that it's happened many times. I mean, I come from German and Scandinavian heritage for the most part, and our sanctuaries in the same way are filled with depictions of Jesus who looks a lot more like me than Jesus actually looked. So it really begins with that place for all white Christians of self-introspection and of trying to find who Jesus is outside of a mirror of ourselves. So I begin there, and from there, and from really listening to hear, what is Jesus saying? I always experience Jesus saying, look for the most vulnerable, look for whose voice is not being heard, and look for who's experiencing the most suffering and rejection. And that is in many cases the place where Jesus' voice is most powerfully heard, which is the total opposite of the Christian nationalist message that says that Jesus is in the strength, Jesus is in the rich, Jesus is in the powerful.
I read a story, might be apocryphal. It's one of these that's too good to fact check, about a church somewhere in the South that commissioned a Jesus statue, but cast as a homeless person on one of the benches near there, or probably within, church grounds. And the congregation, some of them lost their minds, depicting Jesus as a homeless person. You're nodding your head. Are you familiar with that story?
I am. Yeah, I think it's real. I think it's a real story. It's a great story.
Yeah. Do you think there is a way back for the evangelical church? I'm not talking about, the more traditional churches that haven't bought fully into MAGA and the messianic Trump figure. But is there a way back for those evangelical churches, given how fully bought in they are to this violent vision of masculinity and this angry version of Jesus? And if people think I'm overstating it, I encourage them to just do a Google image search for Warrior Christ. It will keep you up at night. I'll put some of the screenshots from the first page of the Google search up here. How do you recover from that as a church?
Yeah, or Google Trump Jesus.
Yeah,
Google
Trump
the images
Jesus,
of
even worse.
Trump's face superimposed onto the Savior's face. Well, I'm a person who, as much as I try to be cynical, and I have that cynical side of me as a journalist, I do believe in resurrection. I do believe in the new life that comes after death. And And so I always do come back to a place of hope. And I don't believe that anyone is without hope for resurrection. I don't believe anything is too broken for God to redeem and to heal. That's really the cornerstone of my faith. And so when we look at, where is that place of hope? So much of the work that I do is work in churches and work in places of faith and community groups. And so much of what is at the heart of this movement is grief. I end up speaking to a lot of people who have family members who've just been completely lost to conspiracy theories, to sort of this cult of Trumpism. And where I find hope really is looking at the wisdom of 12-step recovery groups and this acceptance in some ways of powerlessness against a movement that is bringing in a lot of evil and violence and death. And at the same time, boundaries around your own acceptance of being willing to hear some of this hateful rhetoric, even from your loved ones. At the same time, countered with finding ways to hold on to trust and relationships. I've been following too, these stories coming out about some of Tim Walz's family members who, including his brother. And that's been a part of my story too, of navigating family relationships across political differences and across family members who've been big Trump supporters. And what I'm really grateful for is that in our family's case, we've managed to hold on to the relationships and trust and respect for one another. And I think it's really important, especially for white Christians in our own families and our own communities, to try to have still that sense of trust that when people finally, whatever it is that makes them think, I don't think Trump's my Messiah, they're going to have somebody to talk to say, hey, how do we begin to rebuild? And how do I begin to find my faith again?
Yeah, that is so hard. And I have not always or even often succeeded in that. But I keep going back to a bit of advice. I can't remember who gave it to me, but it really applies perfectly here, which is that we have boundaries for people we want to keep in our life.
Yeah.
If you don't want to keep someone in your life, you don't care enough to have, rules and boundaries and you just dismiss them. But those boundaries are helpful and maybe they allow that relationship to survive long enough to get you to a place where they're ready to come around. I have experienced that with a couple of people I'm close with. We haven't talked politics, at least in a confrontational way, for years, and then finally they're ready, and that gives me hope. Angela, thank you so much for coming on. Remind people when the new book comes out and where they'll be able to find it.
Yeah, so you can pre-order it now, and I would love for you to do that. It's available anywhere books are sold. You can also sign up for my Substack, and you can get a little bit of a preview of the book there. It's at I'm Listening or just angeladenker.substack.com. And I look forward to hearing your stories and hearing from people who hear this, what their stories are.
Great. The book is Disciples of White Jesus. We'll put the non-Amazon link down below. And thanks so much. Let's talk again soon.
Thanks, Ken.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.